Midnight, Friday, the 5th of May 2007, Kenya Airways Flight 507 began taxiing. 6 minutes later, it took off from Douala International Airport, Cameroon, storming into the pitch dark, rainy and stormy skies of Douala. Destination, Nairobi, Kenya. However, the aircraft, which had 114 people, was only in the air for 1 minute and 42 seconds before it crashed, killing everyone on board. It took more than 2 days before the wreckage was found and the air crash confirmed. Only 58 pieces of remains were recovered. 56 people were never found. 16 years down the line, NTV brings you the how and why of the KQ507 air crash. I am Duncan Haemba. A concoction of sounds that precede takeoff. The whirling engines. The radio communication. The cabin crew's instructions and the passengers' banter all coming together to create that aura. That is the in-flight atmosphere before taking to the skies. A dark night in Douala, Cameroon was about to get darker. Kenya Airways Flight 507 Boeing 737-800 had a two-leg trip from Abidjan, Ivory Coast, through Douala and onto its intended final destination, Nairobi. Majority of the passengers on the aircraft were to connect to other flights for completion of their journeys. 9 Kenyans, who included 6 crew members on board. The ill-fated aircraft began its journey for Nairobi on the evening of Friday, the 4th of May 2007, departing from Abidjan International Airport at 6:30 p.m. with 55 passengers on board. It landed safely at Douala International Airport at 1 minute past 10 p.m. 38 passengers disembarked and 91 others boarded for the second leg of the trip. Takeoff was scheduled for 11 p.m. However, there was a problem. The weather was horrible, terrible. It was stormy. Torrential rains accompanied by heavy thunderstorms were pounding Douala, making it impossible for any landing or takeoff. The flight was delayed, just as was the case for 2 others operated by Cameroon Airlines and Royal Maroc. Pilots were asked to wait for the weather to improve. As it approached midnight, with an hour's delay already on the clock, Kenya Airways flight captain decided to take to the runway and to the skies, headed for Nairobi.
We were actually expecting a flight from Douala, which is going to connect into China. Now, Africans are basically traders. And the airline business works with traffic flows. So their traffic flows of people have come from West Africa, going to China, going to India. Now, at that particular morning, 5 a.m., the aircraft did not arrive.
The signal had been, before it was raised by the operations team, I think it was 3 or 4 hours. Before we were then asked to come together as a team, because it's all across the board.
Kenya Airways top brass hurriedly assembled at the airline's Embakasi headquarters on the second floor, where a war room command center had been set up. A crisis of monumental proportion had struck at the crack of dawn.
Initially, people took a little time, not too much, by the way. People arrived there quite quickly. Took a little time to acclimatize, digest the news. Then the process of communicating with the people in Douala started. And Douala is not exactly the same as Nairobi in terms of the communication.
The first official and public announcement was made by then Kenya Airways Chief Executive Officer Titus Naikuni.
The last message from the aircraft was received by the control tower in Douala immediately after takeoff, but thereafter the tower lost control or lost contact with the aircraft. And so far we have not, and nor has the tower been able to establish contact with the aircraft.
Anxiety, uncertainty, and agony jointly formed the unsettling cloud above the national flag carrier and the nation at large. The country was kept in the dark for nearly 48 hours. KQ chief had to personally appear at State House armed with a map to brief the head of state. The whereabouts of the aircraft remained unknown. A crash had also not been confirmed.
From a structural point of view, and this is all airlines, not just KQ, by the way, you can't confirm anything until the plane is sighted or debris around the plane is sighted.
It took 2 days to locate the wreckage, opening the next phase of a long search for answers to many questions.
I was a bit surprised because what I knew is that the routing of the aircraft was over land. And I asked myself a few questions, at that moment. Why is it that it would take 2 days to locate an aircraft that has crashed over land? If it was crashed over sea, that would be different, because once an aircraft goes into the sea, it's hard to locate it.
Then NTV journalist Dennis Onsarigo spoke to numerous people as he sought to piece together the circumstances around the tragedy.
Cameroon, vast country, yes, but in terms of media engagement, in terms of media awareness, very, very low. So the only source of news we had was the national broadcaster, which was broadcasting gospel songs all the time. And if there was news, then there was no news about this plane that had crashed. So we were in the dark.
For Kenya Airways, the pressure to give answers, and tangible ones at that, was on and growing. From the Kenya and Cameroon governments, families of the crew and passengers, Boeing manufacturers, as well as the insurance provider. On the night of 7th May, a breakthrough came through. The debris of KQ-507 had been sighted at Mbanga Pongo mangrove swamp on the bank of Dibamba River, 5.42 kilometers from Douala Airport. It had been a long wait, a great test to patience, hope, and holistic well-being.
We were not prepared for what we were likely to see that night. So we trekked in the forest. I think it took us an hour or so in this swamp of a forest to get to the plane crash site. And shock of shocks that we didn't even know where we were going. We were relying on locals who were speaking French, They didn't speak Swahili, they didn't speak English, and so we were relying on people we could not even communicate with. And then we were relying on our cell phones to light the path for us into the forest. So we walked to a point where our phones, we ran out of battery. And so we held on to each other's backs as we went through this thick forest. And finally, we were met by a very strong stench of jet fuel and decomposing bodies. Then we realized we have gotten to the crash site.
It's a very sad sight, horrific. This is a catastrophe.
This was a vast crater that had been created by the plane that I think it plunged head on first and then exploded. Okay, so it had created a crater, and then out of this crater, they had created a pool of water. So it was jet fuel, water, muddy water, and then pieces of loved ones all over. So we didn't realize that that previous night when we were there, we had spent like 20 or 30 minutes stepping on bodies, and we had no idea until we came there the following day. And the only thing that could identify was this Kenya Airways colors. One banner somewhere there, a piece of it somewhere there, but the rest of this plane, like, it disappeared. I mean, it was not there. What we had was a swamp. You walk into an open field surrounded by trees, very, very tall trees. And then at the center of this site is a swamp. This swamp has mud and water, but on top of that water is a layer of oil, which was a jet fuel. And then pieces of what used to be a plane lying all over, and some pieces of personal belongings of human beings.
All 114 people on board perished. There were 108 passengers and 6 crew members. The deceased comprised people from 26 countries. Cameroon was the hardest hit with 37 victims, followed by India, which lost 15 people. Kenya had 9 victims, 3 passengers and 6 crew members. There were 7 from South Africa, 6 Ivorians. Nigeria lost 6 citizens, alongside 5 Chinese and 5 Britons. Other countries whose citizens also died in the crash include Comoros, Ghana, Tanzania, Senegal, DRC, Guinea. West Africa had the highest number of victims, many being from the business community.
And here my aircraft has gone down. They're friends of mine on board, and they're giving us big business. Some of those businessmen would actually carry as much as $100,000 on board, had cash to go and buy mobile phones in China. So they'd be moving up and down, up and down.
The Douala crash was a big blow to Kenya Airways. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-800, which was the latest in the market at the time, was only 6 months in service since acquisition from the manufacturer. The image of Kenya's national flag carrier was on the line. The branded Pride of Africa was precariously sitting on the brink. The stakes were high. Anti-terror police, then National Security Intelligence Service Director General, and the Kenya Air Force personnel were dispatched to establish whether it was a terror attack. Royal Air Morocco Flight 287 that was lined up successfully took off after Kenya Airways flight. The third flight also successfully lifted off from Douala Airport, begging the question, what befell the KQ flight? The government of Cameroon set up a technical commission of inquiry to establish the cause of the accident. A report that was released on 28 April 2010. NTV has obtained that report from the Cameroon Civil Aviation Authority. It is titled Technical Investigation into the Accident of B737-800, registration 5Y-KYA, operated by Kenya Airways, that occurred on the 5th of May 2007 in Douala. The investigation revealed various things, which span from before the flight on to the sudden, fatal end of the journey. First, before takeoff, the report indicates that, among other things, no malfunction was recorded in the aircraft technical log. The aircraft and engines were operating normally, and the aircraft's weight and balance were within prescribed limits. Detectives also found out that had been adequately rested, plus they had valid licenses and all required qualifications. While all these were among the positive findings, the investigators also found that Air Traffic Control did not broadcast latest weather reports to KQ507, yet the principal meteorological center at Douala Airport issued special weather reports covering the specific flight's departure period. The report notes that the captain is the pilot flying. He does not adhere to standard operating procedures, does no cockpit scan, has poor situation awareness, and reacted inappropriately in the face of the abnormal situation.
Najua swali lililo katika miongoni mwetu ni kuwa ajali hii ilitokamana na nini. Ningewaelezeni ya kuwa kwa sasa bado hatujajua, na serikali ya Kenya na ya Cameroon bado yaendelea na uchunguzi.
Now, on to the takeoff. The Kenya Airways plane took off without authorization from the air traffic control. The report points to the same human dynamics on the captain and the first officer's part, which contributed to the turmoil in the storm. Various pointers led to the ruling out of a technical error as the cause of the plane crash, and effectively singling out the pilot error as the cause. A background check conducted against the captain revealed that he had some red flags in his history and poor cockpit skills. In this case, there was a fallout in the cockpit. The captain and his first officer were not working as a team, and the first officer did not call out lapses in piloting. The findings indicate that it appears the first officer concentrated on inputting the route around the heavy storm and failed to engage the autopilot, while the captain, on the other hand, assumed it had been engaged. He released the control column. There was no one controlling the aircraft, not the pilots, not the autopilot. KQ507 was flying itself, and no one was monitoring the instruments. If any would have looked down, would have noticed it was flying on FD, or the flight direct mode, and not the autopilot. 16 seconds after warning, the aircraft continued its treacherous roll to the right, ultimately crashing. The emergency locator transmitter broke on impact, and therefore no useful signal was emitted to assist in locating the plane after the accident. With regard to the fallout between the 52-year-old captain and the 23-year-old first officer, the investigation team zeroed in on the cockpit voice recorder. The recording of the first leg from Abidjan to Douala revealed why the first officer remained silent after being shouted and shut down by the captain. The captain was heard screaming at the first officer, asking what was wrong with him. And when the officer asked him whether he had told him to rise to 1,400 feet, the captain retorted, "Yes, don't be stupid. Write it down if you can't remember." He added, "What is wrong with you? Did you not hear the instructions?" Investigators deduced that with that tongue lashing, the first officer shut down, explaining why he was withdrawn most of the time, only engaging the captain in one-offs. At 11:20 p.m., the controller transmitted the data and KQ507 requested clearance and was granted. But at 11:37 p.m. announced cancelling the startup to await for a lull in the weather. Heavy rain and storm had engulfed the airside. Visibility was 800 meters. But 14 minutes later, at 11:54 p.m., the captain asked the first officer to request taxi clearance, and the first officer appeared surprised at the speed at which instructions were being issued. The captain told him to try and keep up. He checked the storm position using the aircraft onboard weather radar and figured the route around the storm, informing the control tower that after departure he would maintain heading left. But the first officer whispered, "To the right," forcing the captain to correct by saying sorry, "To the right." It seems the captain's mind was engaged on how he would navigate the heavy storm. At 6 minutes past midnight, KQ507 took off without takeoff clearance by the control tower, which is a major procedural breach. At 1,000 feet climbing, the captain released the flight controls after 55 seconds and called OK command, but the first officer did not respond in affirmation. The autopilot was not engaged. The captain released flight controls without having engaged the autopilot. The plane was flying itself. The captain appeared unaware of the aircraft's changing altitude and reportedly utters an expression of surprise. The plane began tilting sharply to the right, and at 34 degrees, the bank angle warning sounded. That was when they realized the autopilot was not engaged, prompting intense action in an attempt to level the plane. And that is when a catastrophic mistake was made. The captain engaged the autopilot, but after 5 seconds, out of panic, he again started inputting the yoke and roller pedals, effectively overruling the autopilot, which would have resolved the situation had it not have been interfered with. According to procedure, when the captain calls for autopilot to be engaged, the first officer should push the CMD button and respond by saying, "Autopilot engaged." Just before the bank angle warning sounds, the captain grabbed the controls, appeared confused about the attitude of the aircraft, making corrections in an erratic manner, increasing the bank angle to 50 degrees right. That is when the autopilot was engaged and the inclination tended to stabilize. Then movements of the flight controls by the pilot resumed and the bank angle increased towards 70 degrees. It was at that juncture that the captain screamed, "We are crashing," and the first officer responded in affirmative. A prolonged right rudder input brought the bank angle to beyond 90 degrees, and the aircraft descended in spiral dive. The first officer frantically called out to the captain to level the wings by the right. then quickly corrected and insisted, left, 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 Captain. The bank angle was reduced to 70 degrees and the flight hit the ground, crashing into the swamp.
From my initial investigation on the ground, it was that there was a disagreement between the first officer and the pilot. And when I spoke to an air controller, an air traffic controller down in Cameroon, they told us in private that there was some argument between them and this pilot because he had a birthday to attend in Nairobi, I think the following day. But he was advised that you can't take off because there's a storm, but he insisted I need to take off. So was it a pilot error? From my initial investigation and my initial report, yes, it was a pilot error. But I think years later, I think something came out of it. And yes, the character of the pilot, whose remains I hear have never been found up until now, even the remains of the first officer, was that the pilot was a man who had taken shortcuts in his career, and he was a man who would not get along with his first officer. So maybe that's what led to the crash in Cameroon.
Kenya Airways flew family members of all people on board the ill-fated plane to Douala to assist in DNA identification of 50 pieces of remains recovered. For 56 others, the site itself loudly spoke to their unanswered questions. They had arrived with the hope of at least getting remains of their loved ones, but that wasn't the case. There was nothing to identify, nothing to repatriate back home, and nothing to bury.
Que tu coulerais, il n'a pas dit que tu sombrerais, il a dit
That is something it's difficult to describe. In fact, let me not even go far from home. Even the captain's family, there was no body. The cockpit, there were many with no remains. The emotions, the tension, it was not easy. It's something I can't describe. 5 months of quietness, then there are no remains. I can't describe it. There was no closure. Do you know, without a body, it's very difficult to tell anybody anything. I'll never forget the wife of the captain and his children. There were no remains of their dad. I can't describe it. I can't describe it.
I remember this young lady who had a family member who had traveled, was one of the people at the crash site. And now they started picking pieces, and they'll find some hair in some corner, and then they'll scoop the entire earth of that area and put it in a body bag. They'll find a leg somewhere there, and then they'll scoop that area with the pieces of meat that were once belonging to a human being and put them in a body bag. And then they started cutting them away. And I think we were there for around 2 or 3 days, seeing this exercise taking place. And it wasn't very easy for family members. It wasn't even very easy for us as journalists.
What touched me were the children. They needed closure. And I could see them go into the swamp, pick the mud, cry into tears, dropping into the water. There was so much emotions. And standing there, some had so much, I don't know what to use, resentment to KQ. And here I am. The emotions of this thing, the reality of the event, I can't describe it. What happened in Bangapungo. You could feel the spirit there. You could feel it. You could feel it. It's still in my mind till today. We spent hours there as the people cried. I really cannot describe it.
Having stayed on the beat for over 10 days, the psychological hit on journalists was inevitable, birthing trauma.
The fact that we were flying and using the same flight path that night and flying at the same time when Kenya Airways 507 left, and flying during a night when it had rained so much, and replaying all these pictures and understanding that KQ went down at night when there was a storm, it was the most trying moment for me. It really affected me. And then coming across these dead bodies, coming across these remains of what was once human beings, it was the most trying moment for me. Yes, when we came back, later I was joined by Sarah Kimani. So Nation Media Group organized a counselor for me because I think even these family members we left down in Cameroon were going through some counseling those 14 days. But I was there as a journalist, minding my own business. When I landed here, I realized I also needed some counseling.
Kenya Airways contracted a South African firm to assist in the DNA identification. But for the 5 months, nothing seemed to be moving. There was a standoff between Kenya Airways and Cameroon authorities. After the initial trip to Cameroon at the time of the crash, for 5 months, neither KQ nor Kenya government top officials visited Douala. This offended the government of Cameroon, which on its part declined to issue a clearance to allow repatriation of the remains. Families of the victims were getting impatient. The South African company had failed to deliver. Dan Okwiri was at the time KQ's manager in charge of cargo revenue capacity. The airline's human resource management asked him to fly to Cameroon and take charge.
Look at this man. Is when the dimensions of the problem were actually dawning on me that there's a serious problem in KQ. The families are making noise, the insurance are screaming, the public and families, victims, are wondering why we have kept silent for 5 months. We don't know what's happening. We have no information from that team, ex-team in Douala. We are hemorrhaging financially. Things are not rosy in KQ. So as I sat and looked at the situation, I knew things were bad. The next thing he did, he said, Dan, we're going to give you a power of attorney to act on our behalf. Any decision you make, we will go with you. Your job is to clean up, conclude, wash the scene, clean, and lastly, bring the bodies back home.
He claims upon landing in Douala, he met hostility from the team he was taking over from, who had called Nairobi demanding to know why the turn of events, considering KQ had been paying for their upkeep for more than 5 months.
I was pretty startled at what was going on. At that point, I said, I need basically two things. I want the status of each victim, the status of all the 114 victims in terms of paperwork and the position. The second thing I want to know is what is the one big thing that has been hindering the repatriation of these remains? That was my two questions I had. The next thing that happened, there was rage in the room, octane rage. You know, here am I. There was some, it looked like this team had some disdain for Africans. And here came this cocky man wearing a gaudy beady belt. And the next thing I saw, she actually flung all the paperwork towards me and said, don't think for a minute that you're going to finish in a week what we've been doing for months. A few minutes later, she was calling Nairobi. Flurry of phone calls to the KQ top leadership. You've sent someone here who's a bit cocky. We've been working hard. We have DNA'd all the victims that we could get. And this bloke thinks is within, he's dictating to us what to do. When I was called by HR director, I told him, Paul, I'm here to get a job done. Let me do it. Let me do it. That's why I'm here. Yeah? Give me time. I left the room. With a little paperwork I could pick.
Dan Okwiri managed to secure an appointment with the governor of Douala. Cameroon authorities were still furious, seething with anger.
From the beginning, I could see tension was mounting up. Tension was mounting up in that room. And I was in an octane red, hot oven. And I could feel that I was just about to get fried. I could feel the tension pulsating in that room. As I sat there was a flurry of discussions. And after being welcomed, I have so much emotion when I'm saying this. The governor banged his table and said, for goodness sake, 37 of our citizens died on that aircraft. The last 5 months, we have seen nobody from KQ. Today, we see you. We have actually been waiting to engage with Kenyans. Instead, you send a team from South Africa to handle this issue. It's sensitive to us. This is our blood that has poured. As I sat there, I knew things were getting thick. And as he's saying this, the guys with the 4 men with the AKs are pacing up and down. And it was getting very, very tense. Very tense. As I sat there, the next thing that I could sense that he must have had access to information I didn't have on what caused the crash. He talked about the pilot taking off in defiance with the air traffic control, who advised him that the weather is bad, but insisted on flying.
Talks in the first meeting ended without success for KQ. But on the second day, Okwiri managed to prevail upon the governor, who finally agreed to give clearance for processing of death certificates to allow repatriation of remains, but gave a condition that a requiem service was to be conducted in Douala within 10 days, and KQ was to fly in family members of all the 114 victims from 26 countries that were affected. This was both a logistical and emotional nightmare.
Only 58 remains were found. 56 had no remains. Handling a person with the remains is easy because there's closure. Talking to a victim's family with no remains is hell, is hellish, because they demand the remains. Here was I with a line of 114 people, 114 families, who were asking me questions. They've been waiting for 5 months. Pretty much nothing has been happening. They had so many questions. And they wanted answers. I remember, and I'll never forget this, there was a lady who lost her husband. She was from India. Her father-in-law, her brother, her cousin, 5 members of the family. There were no remains. As I gave her the allowance to come to Douala, she was holding me by the neck. Her eyes were glassy and no tears. When you see someone crying without tears, that's more painful than anything. You can see there are no tears. And she asked me, I don't need your money. I don't have a life after this. Where are my... I need remains. I want to see my people's remains. There was nothing. So as I was handling the queue of 114 people, there were so many raging issues here. I'll never forget them. We had so many people with different grievances. You know, Africans, we're not people who have 1 or 2 wives. Some of us have many wives. So there were many issues here. There was issues of compensation. And you know, when someone dies, compensation runs to as much as $100,000, which is big money. And whoever you consign, you know, sorry, I'm using one, you forward the body to, you know, the person you forward to the body to is the person most likely to get the compensation. So I could see some who even pastors, everyone is insisting that the remains should be sent to them, consigned to them. So I had to use a lot of wisdom, where I could see there were issues of 2 women pulling together, pulling against each other. I could suddenly note that. And in my mind, I would just suddenly find it if the parents of the victim are alive. And I would suddenly note that, and I would note that I'm going to forward, if there was a remain, to the parents, to the living parent, because that would solve the problem for now. Because if you forward it to this side, the families would fight over many issues.
It was 5 months after the plane crash, and some of the relatives were returning to the scene of the accident for the second time, and unlucky again, making it extremely painful.
Nothing could satisfy them. And why had we taken so long? It was difficult. I can't describe it to you in a humanly possible way. Trust me. It was bad. It was bad. It was bad. And here you are. For those with the remains, it was easy enough. Not that there was much in remains. I'm talking here about fingers, hands, piece of the skull. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. Duncan, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy.
Some of the repatriations had peculiarities. For instance, victims who were Indians had to be cremated. it was difficult locating a crematorium in Douala, but it had to be done nonetheless.
Cremating an Indian involves many things like getting firewood, getting ghee, getting rice, walking around the remains with a pot of water, lighting the pyre, which I did on behalf of KQ, because you have to light it so that the spirit can escape, taking the skull and poking it, but if there's no skull, you poke through the charred remains so the spirit is released. And finally, because the victims were not there, but I had to do it on behalf of KQ. It was a big occasion because the families were not there. And after that, they handed over to me. And for these 5, 6 victims, I had to sleep with these ashes for 2 weeks in my hotel room of these people. I could feel their spirit in my room because they were handed over to me. There's nowhere else to keep these ashes. And these ashes, I would have to travel back with them to Nairobi. And I'll tell you a little bit about that because for 2 weeks I slept with ashes of people I never knew. You can imagine the emotions I had in that room. I don't drink whiskey, boss. But sometimes to keep sane, I could take a whiskey at night, a bottle, and I'm still sober. Trust me, in that room. I don't take whiskey, anyone who knows me. Completely sober. Because these spirits I could feel the spirits of these people. It was very, very emotional. So for the next couple of days, I was chartering aircraft, sending the bodies to South Africa, sending bodies to all these places, one by one and one by one. But what touched me most was my colleagues, because I had a personal connection with these people. I remember Jerry, the flight pastor who passed on, was a personal friend of mine. I can't describe it, boss. I can't describe what I'm going to say. So I remember that particular day when I was doing the final airlift for my colleagues. I asked coffins to be sent from Kenya, for all the nine crew members. Some of them there were no remains. But symbolically, there was a coffin. 9 Kenyan flags. Flowers from Kenya. You remember, there are no flowers in Cameroon because there are no Cameroons, all those, they don't have flowers. They get their flowers from France. I dressed these coffins.
Having successfully accomplished his mission in Douala, Okwiri flew back to Kenya. Unfortunately, he did not last long at the airline. He says one afternoon he was handed a dismissal letter, ending his run at the airline after having worked for 25 years.
I was never the same man after Douala. Never. Douala exposed the underbelly of KQ, the soft belly of KQ. There were more questions I had than answers. There was a lot of anger I had even within me as a person. Because when I went to Douala, no one had told me what to expect. As much as the job was done, I had more questions in myself. It was not an easy few days after that. Yes, I was done away with. But I walked out with my head high. Sometimes a warrior who fights a battle is dispensed with for obvious reasons. I was not fired for any misdeeds, but my outspokenness in many things in KQ. KQ had changed gravely. the old team was being phased out and a new team was coming.
Okwiri left the city and migrated to Migori, where he runs his businesses. He is currently documenting a book titled My Life in Aviation, 25 Years. Duncan Haemba for NTV.